IVM.
Paying your credit card bills on time is a great policy. This IPL season, with the Cred Mega Jackpot Week from 27th April to 3rd May, stand a chance to win some fabulous prizes like one Tata Safari car or gold worth 10 lakhs or even one entire Bitcoin worth close to 50 lakhs. Now that is amazing. Don't miss out. Just download Cred.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat. Hello and welcome to All Things Policy. I'm Manoj Keval Ramani, and today I have with me my colleague Prateek Wagre, and we're going to be talking about the controversy surrounding the information ecosystem in India with regard to the current COVID-19 crisis. And the controversy essentially is with regard to the government asking social media firms to delete some content, which the government said was an action taken in keeping in mind that it could create panic or it was fake news. But then there's been a whole sort of controversy around it because there's been lots of criticism of the government considering its priorities at this point of time. But let's sort of try and unpack this. So Prateek, first, welcome to this conversation.
Thanks, Manoj.
So tell us exactly what's happened. From what I understand, that Twitter had been asked to delete some tweets, and that led to some controversy. So just tell us exactly what's happened.
Yeah. So let me give you a timeline of how things uncovered and how we kept finding out things. Right? Because I think that's also interesting in the way people have reacted to it. So around the evening of 24th April, right, Medianama reported that Twitter had taken action against 50 odd tweets, and they had disclosed this to the Lumen database. Right now, the Lumen database is a voluntary project run by the Berkman Klein Center of Internet Society at Harvard. Right, which includes disclosures by companies like Twitter, Medium, YouTube, and Wikipedia, a few others. Right, it started off as something to monitor copyright takedowns, but then it evolved into all sorts of other requests as well. Right? And I'm stressing on that because this is a voluntary mechanism. Right, and we found out just because Twitter happened to disclose this action. And immediately the conversation became Twitter-centric and how Twitter is complying with government orders, etc. And then it started slowly coming to light the next morning that other platforms had received these orders too, right? And again, that's interesting because we found out about Twitter because they disclosed it. In the other case, we only found out because government sources happened to tell reporters that they also sent orders to Facebook and Instagram, right? And until we're recording this on Monday, right, on 26th April, we still don't have confirmation explicitly whether Facebook and Instagram actually went ahead and complied with the orders that they received, right? So that's still left to speculation. But what's happening with the conversation around this is that it's taking two forms, right? One is completely centered on Twitter, saying that Twitter is collaborating, etc. Or on the other hand, you have instances where there is just an assumption that all the platforms that got these takedown orders have complied, which we don't know for sure. Now, it's possible that they all have, but at this point, it's just something that's unknown.
Okay, so what I'm reading is that essentially there were 2 days on which there are these 50 odd tweets around which, like you said, this conversation is broader than Twitter, but at the moment we only know about Twitter. And there are these 2 days on the 22nd of April and the 23rd of April where there is a request to remove these materials. Twitter has complied with most of this from what I understand. Is there any details available about the nature of these tweets? Because from what I understand, the government says that these were spreading disinformation or fake news, the terrible term, and had the potential to create panic. Is there any sort of information about what these tweets were?
Yeah. So actually, the tweets. So the mechanism that Twitter has instituted to deal with these kind of requests is that they just block. They just withhold those tweets in certain countries, right? So if your user account is set to India, as the location of user account is set to India, you don't see these tweets.
Okay.
If it's set to the US or UK, you still very much have access to these tweets. So these tweets can still be seen, right? And the sense that looking at them, it's mostly been about how the COVID-19 crisis is unfolding in India, right? In some cases, you've had tweets from verified accounts. You've had, I think, notably Pawan Khera, Congress spokesperson. One of his tweets was taken, was actioned against, and he's gone to the extent of sending, I believe, a submission to Ravi Shankar Prasad, asking for a direction that Twitter, take back their action against his tweets. Right. So we do have a sense of what it is. It's largely things that are critical of the way the government has handled COVID-19 crisis. And I believe the Indian Express also reported that in some cases there also happened to be tweets that had photos and videos of the recent Maoist ambush in Chhattisgarh. I think some of those were concerned, but largely it's been about how the government has handled the second wave of COVID-19.
Okay, so we can see that obviously there is obviously politics involved in all of this, and we're seeing Twitter complying with this. What's been Twitter's argument as to why they've complied? Did they deem these tweets as fake news, disinformation? Under what logic have they complied?
Yeah, so they've got a policy which says that look, if the content in question is against the law in a particular country, they will withhold it from that country, right? And that seems to be the policy they've invoked in this case. And you can infer that based on their statements and the fact that they've just withheld them. They've not actually deleted those tweets or flagged them in any way, right? But what we don't know is which laws that were they supposedly in violation of. That is unknown. That is something that neither the government has said. And I believe ANI put out a statement that is attributed to METI. Even that doesn't specify which law they used or which law they believe had been violated. And neither has Twitter seemed to have indicated that in any of the notifications that they've sent users. Right? It's been a case of this was found. We just believe that this was in contradiction with the law and etc.
Okay, fair enough.
It is unknown. You can probably infer, right? And then this is speculation based on the fact that over the last year, a lot of action against social media posts, for quote unquote fake news and spreading panic. Typically, the Epidemic Diseases Act and the National Disaster Management Act has been invoked. But we don't know for sure, right? And that is something that I've uncovered, the pattern that I discovered as I researched this for my newsletter week on week. But in this case, again, we don't know whether it was specifically those that have been invoked. And again, the way that the blocking rules in the IT Act work, Section 69A, the government is not obliged to disclose this information either.
It's fascinating when you use the term, quote unquote, spreading disinformation and what was the other aspect that you said? Spreading disinformation and
creating panic. And fake news.
Immediately that sort of brought to my mind. There's a phrase that they use in sort of Chinese parlance when it comes to, taking down social media content or, when people are detained for their online activity. There's a phrase that's used which is picking quarrels, provoking trouble. And a lot of people last year and even right now were detained under this sort of for this particular violation because of their activities, whether it is activism on the ground or whether it is on social media. But and we'll come to that. We'll come to the sort of broader implication of this. But I want to sort of now go to try and understanding, because we were having this conversation before we started recording about what some of these developments, like you said, over the last year, there have been these cases, and this is the grounds that have been used to take down or at least block social media content. And there may be cases where there is obviously a genuine case of it being fake news, it being disinformation, there being a threat to social order, or there being a threat, the threat of panic and all of that, which I understand. But largely this is really, really murky territory. In
Yeah.
What does this tell us a little bit about, and particularly when we are seeing social media organizations essentially complying with government demands? What does this tell us about the future of governance of the information ecosystem in India? Where is this moving? You were talking about like I said before we were recording, you were talking about a framework, a three C's framework. Can you just first explain that framework?
Yeah. So fair enough. And I apologize for going all consultant with three C's. Uh, Hangover from I think a previous role. Before the three C's, right? So one way is to imagine this is that, and this is a modification of Jack Balkin's triangle of free speech regulation, and it's essentially you picture an inverted triangle, right? On the top left corner you have your state infrastructure. On the top right corner you have your information intermediaries, which in this case is mainly the social media platforms. In some cases, you can argue that news publications also go there. And this is where I deviate from Jack Balkin's original triangle. And at the bottom is where you have your civil society groups, citizens, your ordinary people, right? Like you and me.
Yeah.
And in the information system, these three interact with each other through what academics define as dyad, right? So you have citizens interacting with the state, citizens interacting with the information intermediaries, and vice versa, right? They take that dyadic approach to it. And if you focus specifically on the relationship between these information intermediaries or the social media companies and the state, there are you can at that point where you can think of it as three C's that are available, right? In terms of how they interact with each other. One is cooperation, one is co-option, and the other is confrontation. Right? And again, fairly self-explanatory in terms of what each of them mean. But and what we've seen typically in India is that most of the companies tend to stick to the cooperation or the co-option model, right? Or those methods. Now, I think the most notable example of confrontation was what happened with Twitter recently during the farmer protests, right?
Yeah.
There could be other instances where they just don't come to light publicly, right? And I think it's important to call that out because not everything always plays out in the public sphere.
Yeah.
But it's still overwhelmingly, it seems like in most cases, corporations seem to take the cooperation and co-option route, which is notable because it seems to be a divergence from the approach they take in the Western world, or what they did, what Facebook and Google specifically, how they responded to Australia. Right, so there is that divergence there, right, and that's where it gets interesting, and this is being noticed, right, specifically in the academic circles. I think they are looking very, very closely at what's happening in India, and some have gone to the extent of saying that this is one of the defining battles for the future of internet speech, right? What happens between platforms and the Indian state is going to be a defining battle for internet, for the future of internet speech.
There's a fascinating component of all of this also, and we saw this play out in the last year, right? And predominantly from an American point of view, but also in India. As much as the conversation in India has been predominantly focused on how the state bears heavy on these enterprises and how these enterprises are essentially cooperating, like you're saying, right? The state's trying to co-opt them or is trying to coerce them, and these enterprises eventually end up cooperating in one way or the other. There's very little confrontation that we know about in public, apart from the brief sort of farmers' protest instance that you mentioned. But in the West, there's also been this scenario of the idea that the state needs to do much more because of the corporation's ability to essentially, craft an information ecosystem and to push back against the state. I mean, the example being of Twitter pulling off Donald Trump. Yet there is tremendous amount of verified people who publish insane amounts of propaganda, whether it's from China, whether it's from other countries, whether it's in America. and there's no action on them, even in terms of how they impact the United States ecosystem. So it's not like those guys are being blocked in the United States while they're not being blocked anywhere, while they're being allowed to operate otherwise. And that's the
Yes.
other thing, right? That you need to rein in the power of these corporations. So that's the other narrative. How does that fit into this framework?
Yeah, and that's where it gets really complex, right? Because there is this growing consensus, right, that these platforms need to be reined in, and we must make them in quotes bend to the rule of domestic law,
Hmm.
right? Which you can certainly see that perspective, but where it gets really complicated is that uh, if you force, there's a very good chance that what you force the platforms to do will apply to the rest of the internet, or uh, will have significant impact on the internet as a whole, right?
Yeah.
And secondly, right, and if you start thinking purely outside of the liberal order, right, if you expand your thinking beyond that, it's also important to note that, look, domestic laws are not necessarily consistent across the world,
Yeah.
and even the same set of rules, same set of laws can be implemented very differently between a liberal government and an authoritarian government, right? And that's where it gets really complicated, and I think, again, this is not cotton. It's starting to get some attention that, look, what we force corporations to do here does have an impact on the rest of the world. You can sort of see that conversation starting to happen, but it's not widespread enough, I think, to counter the momentum that's already at work, right? To to rein them in, and this is going to be, I think, a massive trade off in the next few years, that the international community will have to figure this out, right? Because on the one hand, uh, you know there is a legitimate need to sort of to control these platforms to some extent, but it's also important not to do that in a way that makes a lot of people around the world worse off than they are today.
Yeah, I mean, this is a tricky challenge to sort of. This is a really, really tricky balance to sort of strike. I wanted to look at one more thing that I've noticed within the sort of last week or so. Actually, two things, but we'll get to them, each of them, one by one. The first, and I don't know if you've been paying attention to this, is this whole controversy on social media with regard to the delayed response from the United States to the crisis in India. I've been following it for the last 1 week, and the amount of anger that existed and that played out on social media and in mainstream media. And then in the last 24 hours to 40 to 24 hours, where we've seen initially statements by Secretary of State Blinken and Jake Sullivan, and then that conversation between Jake Sullivan and Ajit Doval, and then a statement of tangible US support. And now, for the last 24 hours, I think we've seen basically a whole of government response, at least on social media, from the US government, from President Biden to the Defense Secretary to everybody. And that's sort of assuaged some anger. But yet you're seeing, which I believe is fairly inorganic activity, talking about how, oh, you've delayed and you failed. And I was checking some accounts, and again, this is not a scientific study of a large sample, but some accounts I was checking on Twitter, which basically seemed like they were not genuine accounts, or at least they were created for a certain purpose. And those were constantly talking about, oh, but now you're delayed, and now our trust is broken, and now our trust is broken. So without discounting the fact that there might be genuine frustration, and there is genuine frustration with, export restrictions and so on with the US, some of this seems inorganic, and it's sort of over the last 24 hours while I've been working on, how the Chinese have been covering the crisis in India, I've noticed there's a lot of criticism of, this is a lesson to India about how the Quad hasn't worked and the rest of it. And on the Chinese media ecosystem, I'm seeing a lot of content which talks about how that statement by the State Department's Ned Price about our job is to essentially take care of Americans first, has been played up. Lots of angry messages from Indians on social media has been highlighted over there. Have you been noticing any of this sort of being inorganic? While there is an organic element which I can see, there seems to also be an inorganic element in this.
Yeah, so to be honest, I haven't specifically focused on that aspect of it. Uh, but there is again, and this is I think more from observation rather than any empirical analysis, right? There is almost certainly some sort of concerted effort to change the terms of the conversation, right? Whether it's pointing out that the US took too long to respond, or that we need to be positive and come together in the face of this unprecedented crisis,
Hmm.
right? There is this sort of shifting of responsibility that seems to be happening now. Again, it's very hard to pinpoint in these scenarios that this is outright uh, yeah inorganic activity,
Hmm.
but you can draw an inference from the fact that it seems to be a trend largely in the last 24 to 36 hours, that there might have been some push somewhere, right? So it's yeah, I'm going to say it's hard to really say that this is definitely inorganic, and again, in the way these ecosystems play out, they tend to feed off each other, right? You can have uh, some elements of inorganic content then being picked up by people who are genuinely angry or genuinely feel that way,
Yeah.
and then continuing to amplify it, right? And then it goes into your media ecosystem, which in India is another uh, probably a couple of podcast episodes worth of content there itself, right?
Yeah.
So yeah,
Yeah, no, I mean, I just thought that it was fascinating because this is something that I was observing, and again, I've not done a in-depth analysis using data from each of the accounts, but it seems like there is an element of pushing that narrative, which, like I said, there is an organic existence to it, of course, because the frustration in the last 1 week was
yeah,
real, but it's sort of piggybacking on that to leverage certain political ends. The other thing that I was noticing, which I've already mentioned, is that and this is something that the Indian government also needs to, and subsequent Indian governments need to keep in mind, is that the more you lean heavily towards curbing free speech, the more, without clear justification, and maybe there is a case for robust rules, and again, our judicial capacity is limited to it, for it to be involved in something like this eventually, but it will eventually, because these are sort of free speech aspects. But there is a case to be very, very circumspect when you use such provisions to block information, because it allows for a narrative also internationally, particularly in states which, again, like China or Russia, where the governance framework is very different. Our approach to free speech is very different. It allows the narrative of, look, this is normal behavior.
yeah.
Because throughout the last year, particularly when the crisis in China was going on, you saw a lot of information suppression. And it allows the argument on that side that, look, this is how even so-called democracies behave, so why would you criticize us?
And I think that's certainly there, and there's also to some extent a Streisand effect component to it, right? Which is that this act itself garners so much attention that it seems like it's counterproductive in the short term,
Yeah.
right? But there's also, in my, I guess, overly pessimistic view, there's another way of looking at it,
Mm-hmm.
which is that it's not that time is going to stop with this incident, right? There will be future avenues for such action, and in that case, the impulse is likely to be, look, let's do whatever we can to suppress this information from going out at all,
Yeah.
right? Which is, this time, I'll go back to the voluntary disclosure that Twitter made, right? So this we may not have found out if if Twitter hadn't disclosed this. So next time, why don't we find a way to make sure that Twitter doesn't disclose it? Right? Because it's voluntary. There are potentially ways to tighten enough screws that the commitment to that disclosure becomes shaky.
Yeah.
Right. So it's because and the reason I'm bringing this out is because there is there's a lot of criticism that, oh, look, this is backfiring. This is Streisand effect is kicking in. You've drawn more attention to it. And while that is true, and I don't think the international attention is going away anytime soon. Uh, you It's also dangerous to assume that just getting that attention in itself is going to be enough, or is going to be enough to cause corrective to result in corrective behavior,
Yeah.
right? Because the impulse can very easily be to double down the other way.
Yeah. Yep. No, absolutely. Absolutely. That makes sense. All right. So this has been a fascinating conversation, and I think it's really important as we move ahead and as we see more such instances, which I'm sure we will see. It's important to keep in mind the framework that firstly you've spoken about, because it allows for clear thinking on how one can understand what's happening. But also, I think it's really important for governments and systems in India to sort of prioritize free speech, because that is a critical component of our society, and I think we should be cherishing that rather than clamping down on that. Right. With that, we'll call it a day. Thank you so much, Pratik.
All right, thanks.
The Takshashila Institution is an independent, non-partisan think tank and a school of public policy. We have education programs lasting 1 semester and 1 year that are tailored specifically for people like you. They are all online and you can take them from anywhere. Admissions are now open for our 12-week graduate certificate program in public policy, defense and foreign affairs, technology policy, and health and life sciences. Visit takshashila.org.in/courses to find out more. If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.
I hope you enjoyed that show. If you aren't following us on social media, please do. We're IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. We'd like to thank the sponsors on the network this week, thewholetruthfoods.com, Seat, PayPal, and Cred. We thank you all for your support. Tune into The Note, where Maruk Inayat talks to Dr. Bipin Joshi about the second wave of COVID. He calls it no less than World War III. On The Habit Coach, Ashton was joined by Yoshita Dave, who's a sex educator and intimacy coach. On Paisa Vaisa, Anupam Gupta was joined by Amit Thakkar and Hiral Jain of Market Pulse Technologies, and they talked about trading in Indian markets. All Things Policy by the Takshashila Institute had on board Mihir Mahajan and Pranay Kotastane to talk about the recent changes in the Indian intellectual property front. You should definitely check out the Cyrus Says episode with Ace casting director Mukesh Chabra. They discussed some of his best work. We also had Ira Mukhoti, who has authored various books on history and mythology from a female gaze. The IPL season's in full swing, and we have Edges and Sledges in English and Khel Niti in Hindi if you want to check out cricket content. Really, really great conversations on both of those shows. Do check those out. And with that, I hope to see you again next week.
2020 is a difficult year. A global pandemic, protests, elections, recessions. You get the picture. What we need is a space where we can have nuanced discussions about global affairs and foreign policy. That's where I come in. My name is Hamsini Hariharan, and I host the States of Anarchy podcast. Every second Tuesday, I speak to experts in the field of international relations to make a little more sense of the world. So join me on the IVM podcast app, website, or wherever you're listening to me right now.